First of all, I'm Reince Priebus, and I know I'm about as normal as they come in spite of my wild name. My mother was born in Khartoum, Sudan, and they met in Ethiopia, my mom and dad, and moved here. And the tradition was you just name your kid after your father's father, and that's it. So there was nothing to. So if you saw my big fat Greek wedding, that's my life. So a lot of people have asked me when I come in, how do you pronounce your name? I'm like, I got it. So David and I are going to talk to you a little bit about what happens in the White House. How do we make decisions? Of course, we'll tell you some good stories too. But I thought, and David and I talked beforehand, we'd first just give you kind of our 1-minute life story. Like, how did we get here? How did all this happen to us? What did we do? There's some young people here too that love politics, and so we'll spend 2 minutes each, give you a little bit of background, and then we'll get right into it. David, why don't you start?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for being here, and it's good to be with you, Reince. When I was quite young, I grew up in North Carolina and had a Southern upbringing. And when I was quite young, I decided I wanted to be a professional baseball player. That's what everybody just sort of did in those days. And then between the 9th and 10th grades, I gained about 6 inches in height. I just sort of sprouted up, and I totally lost control. You know, I couldn't throw a baseball very well. I tried out for the varsity baseball team, and we had to do the first meeting in a gym because it was raining. And so we moved in, and I had a catcher I was throwing to, and about the first 3 or 4 pitches went pretty well. And then I threw one, I lost control. And that baseball went through a window on the 2nd floor. So I gave up my plans to be a baseball player. My dad was a teacher at Duke. He was a mathematician at Duke. He convinced me I should find a different line of work. That was pretty good, pretty important for me. In any event, over a period of time, because I was so disjointed and imbalanced, I wound up being a journalist. I started covering games for our local paper in North Carolina, the Durham Morning Herald and the Durham Sun, and I would go to the games, and when the game was over, my dad would drive me to the newspaper's offices. And I would sit down and type out a piece for the next morning's paper on a game I'd been covering, and that sort of one thing led to another. When I was going off to college, my newspaper at that point, the Herald, sent me to New York to be part of a group of people covering the Nikita Khrushchev visit. So I was there in the midst of all this gaggle. And by that time, I really was in a swoon about, newspapering, public life, where can you fit in? Did I want to run for office? Sort of all those kind of questions. Well, I won't beleaguer you with the rest of it, but I decided not to be a baseball player. I came out of law school and went in the Navy for 3.5 years. And while I was in the Navy, was almost recruited to come work in Washington and work on reforming the draft for the White House. And that worked out pretty well. We got the random draft. I can tell that story, but anyway, from that, I thought I was going to go back to North Carolina, but then I got a call from the White House saying, we're trying to reform the draft. We need to form a small little team. Can you come and help? And I agreed to do that. And I thought I was in for 1 year, and I stayed for 3 until Richard Nixon resigned. And then we can talk more about the Nixon days, but I want to get back to our esteemed leader here and make sure we cover all the bases.
No problem. So my story is really a kid who did not have political parents. My dad was a union electrician. My mom was a realtor. I had grandparents and family all in Greece, and they'd come to visit. I don't know if any of you have an upbringing like that, where a lot of your relatives are not Americans, and they come and visit. And in Greek, it's yaya and papu. They would come not just for a couple weeks, but they'd come for a few months, right? But when I was a little guy, I loved my grandfather, and everything he did, I loved. And one thing I remember is that he loved this country. He loved everything about it. And it didn't matter whether it was Carter, Reagan, Kennedy. Oh, they're great. I remember he would read the world books. And he'd grab a world book, a little Johnny Walker, and he'd flip through and read the world books all day long. And I followed him everywhere he went. But the fact that he loved this country, where he was not from, had an impact on me growing up. So I got involved, at the time Reagan was president, I got involved in the Republican Party in Kenosha County, Wisconsin. And a lot of people who were senior at the time loved the fact that this 16, 17-year-old walked in. They gave me a seat at the table. They made me feel like my opinions mattered. I felt like I had purpose, which I always think, with kids, and I've got a 19-year-old and a 13-year-old, that developing a passion for something that keeps you going as a young person was something that I had. And I did everything you could do. I was putting up yard signs. I became college Republican president, student body president, everywhere I went. Then when I graduated from law school, came back to Wisconsin, started volunteering again, got involved from the bottom to the top, every job you can think of. And two of my best friends growing up just happened to be Paul Ryan and Scott Walker. And I said, I think we can build something around these two guys. So we built this party, and we had nothing in Wisconsin, and we won everything. And then on the 7th ballot, I ran for RNC chairman. I won on the 7th ballot. Took all day. So it was hardly a landslide. So then 6 years later, in spite of all the craziness and all the wildness, and I'll spare you the details, suddenly in came Donald Trump. From 16 years old, pizza parties, yard signs, all the improbable things that happened to me. Because I'm not the typical guy that shows up and becomes chairman of the Republican National Committee. And then, he's not going to win. There's no way. Everyone's telling me this is impossible. All of a sudden, he wins. And I end up in the White House. And then 6 months later, I was out of the White House. But the reason I tell you, I was, at the time, I was the longest serving and winningest chairman of the RNC. So I can keep a job for more than 6 months. But my point to the story, and I'd like to do a lot of college events, a lot, because I want the kids to see, and I do a lot of times with Democrats, two things. One, I want kids to see that Republicans and Democrats can have intelligent conversations. We can disagree. It's not all horrible. That's number one. But number two, I want to encourage kids that whether they're Republican, Democrat, whatever it is, to get involved. Because if you don't like politics and you hate, you're sick of everyone hating each other and you're done with it, you can't fix anything unless you get involved. And then the last thing is just that passion. That if you have kids or grandkids, just that finding that passion and purpose is so important. So that's my 2-3 minute life story.
Good.
David has a unique career, obviously, because he worked for Nixon, Reagan, and Clinton.
Ford.
Ford, and Ford, Reagan, Clinton, but he was staff secretary, which, by the way, staff secretary is not the secretary that you would imagine. This is like usually the smartest person in the room, the person that makes sure every detail is followed in the White House. The Presidential Records Act is followed. He was communications director. He was senior counselor. So there is a process, and David's a great person to explain to you how actual decisions are really made in the White House. David.
Well, terrific. Let me correct the record. I was not chief of staff secretary. I was not staff secretary. I was sort of worked with the staff secretary, but I reported into the chief of staff, Jim Baker. He was sort of symbolic of my service there. But the interesting thing for me was how similar in many ways the White Houses have been, and how different they've been at the same time. It's one of these things that they bear, markings of both. I mean, you walk through the halls of the White House, West Wing right now, and I can guarantee you, you would know everything you saw there because you'd seen it before and you dealt with it before. And that made a big difference. But as you know, there can be very sort of above board good politics played within the White House, and then there can be the knives can be out and people are at each other's throats.
I know a little bit about that. A little bit.
Well, you know, you sometimes feel like you got to keep your back to the wall, you know, because you never know what's going to come out of the middle of the night. When I went to work for the Clinton, I'd worked for 3 Republican presidents, and then I knew Bill Clinton. He was a friend for a variety of reasons, and when he asked me to come work for him, because he was in trouble and he was sort of in a ditch with his first year of his presidency, and I agreed to come. There were people in the Clinton White House who felt, I thought, with some legitimacy, that they'd worked their hearts out to elect their president, and he was a Democrat. And what does that president do? He brings in this damn Republican. And they didn't like that. And, you know, for a while, they were gracious about it. But when we had him out of a ditch, when he got, and he deserves the credit for doing that himself, but coming out of that and putting himself in a good position, that's when he went after me, you know, because it was safe. It wasn't disrupting things too much. And it was a rough period when I had to defend myself and wonder what I was doing. But in retrospect, and there were times when I thought Bill Clinton ought to cover for me more than he did, because I put my life on the line for him. And you had this in spades with Trump.
Yeah.
You know, he brought you in here, he put you in a significant position, you're very exposed, you're in there 6 months, but it seemed like 24 months. And it's hard because there are so many forces coming against you. There are countervailing pressures that come against you. So it's not easy to get through, but when I went to work for the Clinton White House, I really got banged around a lot. And then when everything calmed down, when he got himself back on his feet, and I left. I spent some time at the State Department, and then left. But I must tell you, I was, as hard as it was, I was proud I had a chance to do it, because it was represented the kind of politics I believe in. Mm-hmm. And you know, so I felt I was very lucky very lucky to be in the White House. I mean, I think it's a privilege for any American to go work for a president in the White House. And we ought to continue to respect the presidents we have. Too often now we've gotten into a habit of not putting the next person in and knocking them down. And sort of, you know, the first question, I remember when Colin Powell's name was being circulated about, could he be the next president? And I went to talk to him. I said, encouraged him and so forth and so on. And Colin just said, I won't have the support to get the things done we need to do. I'd rather be at the State Department, which is what he did. But it's a very human experience when you go through and realize other people have been banged around too. That it's been that you're not sure who you can trust, and that a lot of it is sort of like building relationships that are meaningful. And some of the best relationships that you and I grew up with tended to be more Republicans sitting down with Democrats. They weren't that big a color differentiation, right? And now it's all changed, because if you're one or the other, you're evil or you're not evil. You know, it makes it very, very hard to govern, and it makes it especially hard for us to inspire our younger generations that they'd like to do this. You know, we need some of the best talent that's out there in the millennial generation and Generation Z to help run the country in the years to come. It's time to pass the torch. It's time I don't care whether it's Biden or Trump. It's really important that we go into an earlier period of time and look for talent there, because there are some really good people coming up on both sides of the aisle. There are some individuals coming up who will do us proud, but we have to help them get there.
Yeah. So sure. I would say that I totally agree. And, obviously there's people that love Biden and love Trump and hate Biden and hate Trump, but the truth is they need good people. And this idea that if you work for Biden or you work for Trump, that, something's wrong with you, that's a bad place for all of us to be. Because both of these folks need the best people that have the best heart for this country and the people that they serve. It's a tough job. I always thought I was more, I would say I'm the chief of stuff, not the chief of staff. But there are people, to give you an idea, in the White House, there's a lot of folks that have, obviously, you would expect, like real jobs that every second of the day, they're responsible for something from morning to night. So if you're the chief of staff, you're responsible ultimately for obviously everything. What the press is, what the meetings are, whether people have been properly vetted or not and are meeting with the president, who did the vetting, why are they here, why isn't this person there? It's everything soup to nuts, and it's all on your plate. You're right about factions in the White House. I mean, even in the days of Clinton and the early Bush days and the early Obama days, I mean, there are factions. And those factions don't just stop at the White House door. So managing that is difficult. So you have your people who have these daily routines that they've got to deal with. But then there's other people in the White House by its nature whose real job is sort of to influence the boss. When you have your senior counselor, your chief strategist, the people that you don't quite know what their job description is, but they always seem to be getting in the way. And you have to try to navigate around what you need to do for the day. If you have like every CEO of every airline, and you're trying to revise the FAA rules for how airplanes are traveling and GPS, and you're making a real change to the system. And you have a presidential decision memo that's coming in the next few days after that meeting. And so the challenge is maneuvering the job of the day and the job of the week through the agendas of people that are all around you. And for the most part, you're on the same team, but that team a lot of times have different opinions about what they want to do. Now, I will say that in the Trump White House, it was a little different, obviously, because the President Trump, learned from and thrived on having people of polar opposite opinion about a particular topic around him, and then throw it up to the group of people in front of him, let them fight it out, and then make a decision. So what I'm saying is, like, you all know what a Bush Republican is, right? I mean, they're kind of the same kind of Republicans. Clinton Democrats, Obama Democrats, they're similar. Sort of the same species, right? I mean, they're all kind of birds, but different kinds of birds. Well, Trump was fine with putting natural predators together. And he'd have on the economy. And they're smart people. Gary Cohn, 20-year president of Goldman Sachs. Wilbur Ross. Bob Lighthizer, who was the biggest China hawk you can imagine. Then, you'd have Steve Bannon, Reince Priebus. And the president would say, hey, what should we do about NAFTA? And there's no walls in this group, and the blood is flowing. And the president's sitting back behind the resolute desk, and people are yelling and screaming. But in spite of the fact that you would read in the paper that this one called this one such, and this guy's fighting with this guy, but the reality is the president did, in spite of it, what you read, he did learn from what I consider to be very smart people about trade in China, NAFTA, and ultimately came to a good decision, which was a bipartisan bill called the USMCA, which is the redraft of NAFTA. So every White House is different, but ultimately the, the law requires, no matter what you may read, that every decision the president makes, whether he jumps you and tweets it, and like, oh, wait a minute, we were going to talk about that this afternoon. Like, well, I decided, I tweeted it out. Okay, but we still have to now get a decision memo in front of you that you need to sign and we need to put in the Presidential Records Act. Most of the time, I would say 95%, even in the Trump White House, we had a Deputies Committee meeting, meaning principals, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security, whatever the issue was, like say, are we going to stay in the Paris Climate Accord or not? Okay, here the front row, you're all principals in this decision. You could be part of one of these agencies, it's your decision. But you have a deputy that goes to these meetings for weeks before you get involved. Once the Deputies Committee meetings are done, then you all show up in the Situation Room down in the basement of the White House. And then you all have meetings. And you narrow the decision down to 2 or 3 options for the president. And you say, at some point, we're going to talk to you, Mr. President, about what we're going to do about the Paris Climate Accord. And a few of the main principals go into the Oval, sit down with the president, say, here's where we're at. Here's the different decisions we think we can make. We're going to talk to you next week again about it. And then the president talks to different staffers about it and calls you on your phone a few times. Come back the next week, president makes a decision, presidential decision memo, signs it, and then the staff secretary takes it, and then the issue is announced. That's really how most decisions are made in a White House because the law requires it. Even if after the fact you've got to come back and draft up the memo. What about, David, your typical day? Because you had so many different jobs in the White House. Can you describe for everyone what a typical day is like?
Yeah, well, let me, before we get there, what you described was very orderly. And and I just wondered, did you feel there was any disorder, or did you?
Sure. Well, I always love it when people would say, oh, just get him to stop tweeting. That's all you need to do. I say, oh, I never thought of that. Wait a minute. You mean if I just get the tweeting to stop, things will be like, okay. Yeah, of course there is. You know, I think every White House has it. And, but the wild thing is that, you know, every president finds their style. And some presidents, they want direct reports, everybody. You're like, no, you don't report to Reince, you report to me. You don't report to David, you report to me. Some presidents are very much, I'll deal with this when you're ready to talk about it and you've done your work. It's just different.
Help us with this, Reince. Help us with what you think life would be like with a President Trump in his second term. Because we've had a number of reports now that the Brookings Institute, not Brookings, but the Heritage Organization has been working with some prospective people who might come work in a Trump White House and a Trump administration. There are like 1,000 positions that possibly could be filled. And that requires us, but what's interesting is this seems to be a much more professional approach than the last time around. I wondered whether we're in a situation where President Trump and the people working for him are now in a little bit better, it's less chaotic and more sort of reliable system. And will he become a more effective president? Would he, in fact, get more of the big things done that he wants to do than he was able to do last time around?
I think that, yeah, totally. I think that the president, the first couple of years, it was kind of getting our sea legs straight, and it wasn't that easy. It's a big place, and there's a lot of moving parts. But certainly, I think a second term of Trump will be more of what he wants to do and faster and quicker, less clumsy, and more precise.
Do you think that will put...
Now, some of you like that, some of you hate that, but that's the truth.
I was going to say, do you think... Did you treat that with greater fear or greater welcoming?
It depends what you like. I mean, if you like if you like the policies of Donald Trump, they're going to come quicker, faster, leaner, with less mistakes.
And what do you think the role of the chief of staff will be in a new Trump?
Same. I think President Trump is a person who I don't even know if a chief of staff is completely, whether it's a chief of staff or a chief operating officer, is more what President Trump likes, because he likes direct reports. He likes to be involved in every detail of every decision. It might surprise you, but I mean, he was involved in every detail of everything going on 24/7. And that's what he likes. And he doesn't like it when he thinks that things are going on behind his back, or maybe you're trying to get a consensus on something before you get to the president. He's the kind of manager that would prefer to know the ins and outs and the drama involved in you trying to get that consensus than you just saying, listen, I'm not going to bother you with all these details until I have something to report to you. No, he'd rather know all the details. It's very different, because most people like that wouldn't want to get involved.
Since he's more got a better control of things, if he offered you a job, would you take it?
I don't know. I mean, I think I've had my share of it, but I wouldn't mind helping. I mean, I certainly don't think he would ever ask me to do that, but I think to be helpful, back to our first point, I think you want to have good people that can be helpful serving the president, no matter whether you like the president or not. Certainly I think I'm a good person that can be helpful. I think I'm a good person to have in the room. But I like what I'm doing now. I'm running my firm. I'm in the Navy Reserves, and I'm doing well.
Good.
So why don't you describe, David, because this is a fun story. I can go first if you want, but your best and worst day in the White House.
Well, there were different days, obviously. I never got over the fact that Ronald Reagan had a taste for style. He really enjoyed it. I think it was Nancy's doing in part. But things happened in that administration in retrospect that were quite wow. One day in the life of the Reagan presidency, it was when he went to Europe, and we woke up in the morning. And there's about a dozen in the White House party that's there, and we woke up in the morning in France, in Versailles, and we walked around that. Then we went out to helicopters, flew to Rome, went downtown, had lunch with the Pope, went back out, got into helicopters, flew to the UK. We had dinner with the Queen. A day in the life of the Reagan White House. Of course, that was typical. But it was like, you got to be kidding me. But it was like, it was an honor to be there, and it was like stunning to be there. And you realize these relationships with other countries matter too, and having sort of a strong, thoughtful response to the world and American leadership matters. So that was one of the best days. I had some, I have to tell you the day that the phone rang and it was Al Haig asking if I and other sort of mid to upper level people would come and see him in the White House. And 6 or 8 of us came. And he ran and he presented the evidence to us that the president had been lying the whole time about Watergate. And that was just, it was devastating, because we'd been out there telling the world this is the reality, when in fact the reality was over here. And Richard Nixon had many things to recommend him. He was one of the brightest people I've met in public life. Certainly he and Henry Kissinger were the best strategists we've had in the White House for a long time. There was much that was good about that, but then there was also this quality, this dark side, and that you couldn't have one without the other. And that was sobering. It was really sobering. And of course, he almost went to jail.
So my best day was probably my first day. No, no, I would say, but it is true. My best day, to me, when I think about it, I mean, I really did. I know it was wild. I totally get it, what you're thinking, but you know, that day when I said I was blessed to be there, you know, like Morning Joe loves to make fun of me for saying I'm blessed to be here, because I did think it was a blessing, in spite of the challenges, in spite of the ups and downs. I mean, to be in that position, to be able to go into that White House every day, that was just, it is a blessing, you know, even if it was rough at times. So my first day was amazing to me because I told you I started growing up and everything I'd done, and I'd never been in the Oval Office until my first day, because when I was chairman of the Republican National Committee for 6 years, Barack Obama was the president. So I was never going to step foot in the White House. So the first day I was up, the parade was done. I was up in the residence having dinner with the president, and he looked at me and he said, "Do you want to go down to the Oval?" I said, "That would be great, let's go." And the residence is quite a walk down and across to get there. So it's pitch black. We're following the Secret Service down the colonnade, and we're getting into the West Wing. And we walked into the Oval Office, and it was dark and not a sound. And we walked in, and I remember I was standing where David was, and President Trump was over like this. And I looked over at him, and he was just standing like this. And he was looking at the ceiling, and he said, "Wow." And it was the first time that I looked at him, because, you know, he's a force of nature. He's never going to show, even if he's afraid or scared, he's never going to show anything. But when he looked at me and said, "Wow," I saw something for, you know, the weight and the responsibility. And then he looked at me and he said, "Can you believe it?" And I said, "No, Mr. President, I can't believe it." And then I went on to my office. And this is the wild part about all of this. Your chief of staff, the press release goes out. There's no training. There's no I went to a exercise for what happens if there's a hurricane, what are you going to do? You do get walked through nuclear codes, things like that. But you're running the government. You walk into that empty office, and there's a Bible verse and a password for the computer. And that's it. And you go. And it was wild. And honestly, I could entertain you guys for hours with stories. But that's how you start. And then, you know, you find out the next day the FBI is interviewing someone down the hallway. Like, oh my God, what's that about? Then we have a travel order. The Attorney General says, "I'm not enforcing the travel order." You say, "Okay, well, now what are we going to do?" It's like, "Well, tell the Attorney General she's gone." Okay, well, now we don't have Attorney General. Someone says, "Well, why don't we talk to Chris Christie?" I say, "Well, wait a minute. I think you have to be Senate confirmed to be an acting Attorney General. Check the Constitution." Like, "You do? Well, who's Senate confirmed?" "Well, U.S. attorneys are Senate confirmed." "Well, let's figure out who we're going to call." You call up a U.S. attorney. Say, "Hello, this is Reince Priebus, Chief of Staff of the White House. I'd like to talk to you about being the acting Attorney General of the United States." What I'm telling you is, like any job and anything you're good at, and I'm presuming that many of you that are here have been good at a lot of things throughout your life. You wouldn't be here. But a lot of it is making decisions, having the guts to make a decision, learning quick to do it. And it is an unbelievable task to be given. But that's what it's like on day one. Worst day? For sure, there was a day I walked into the Oval Office. It was in March, and it was before the president was going to give his joint address to Congress. And what I didn't realize, which I normally would, but I was scrambling that day, was that these were the people that were going to be in the audience during the speech that were meeting the president. And I saw a gal, maybe in her 30s, with two little kids, like 8 and 9, cute, dressed up, meeting the president in the White House. They were kind of arguing a little bit, and Mom was nervous, and I'm looking over at her, and I'm thinking, who is that? And I figured it out, because a few weeks earlier, Jim Mattis and Mike Pompeo and Joint Chiefs Dunford and others came in to see us to carry out a mission. If you recall, there was a time, maybe you don't, but some of you may remember there was a time when we were being told that there was an ISIS cell that was building bombs on laptops, and the idea was that they'd get on a commercial airliner at 35,000 feet and they'd put the bomb next to the window and blow the airplane up. So there was a concern that that cell was building those bombs. Barack Obama was going to carry out the mission a month earlier. The circumstances didn't lend itself well, and it turns out that there's a night coming in Yemen with no moon, pure darkness, and we're going to send in the Navy SEALs. Of course, everyone agreed. I was one of many that agreed, but it was not a, it was for, Mattis and everyone was 100%, this is what we need to do, fine. So I'm looking at this gal, and it turns out that her husband, Ryan Owens, Navy SEAL, died in that firefight. First time that happened. And not that you'd ever, you think to yourself how easy it was for me. No, I wasn't going to change anyone's opinion. Everyone was unanimous, the biggest players in defense. But you think to yourself how easy it was to say yes. Yes was the right answer, but the guilt and those two little kids, they didn't know, they didn't get it. Could Dad have been going back and forth to Afghanistan and Iraq a lot of times? No idea. Dad's not coming back. And that was a day that I'll never forget. I think about all the time. Went into the cabinet room and just kind of lost it because I just thought, oh my God, this is what happens when these decisions are made. And it was just unbelievable. I still get choked up thinking about it, but that was definitely a bad day for me, for our country. So, David, with that, we've thought about a few things to talk to you about beforehand. One of the things that we wanted to talk to you about is kind of the state of the country. What's your sense and why we have this division? It didn't happen overnight. It didn't even happen in the last few years, but it's been building, and just want to share your thoughts and my thoughts on that topic.
Sure, I'll try to be fairly brief to the point. I think there's been a great evolution in the way sort of the White House is run, and what you can expect and not expect. But as I told another audience, we had a World War II generation which was running the country for a while, from sort of Jack Kennedy up through George Bush Sr. These were all people who came of age during the war. They weren't the Ikes of that period, but rather people who fought in the war. We had 7 presidents, but when you look at from starting with Kennedy through Bush Sr., there were 7 presidents. Every single one of those presidents wore a military uniform. All but one were in the war itself. Jimmy Carter was in the Naval Academy when the war was ending. He stayed on at the academy and graduated and went on to serve admirably after the war was over. But it was really, really important. And the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw called them, which I think was the correct way to look at that, they had a special sense of mission, of America having a purpose, America providing the leadership that the world needed for development coming out of the war, coming out of all the brutalities of the war. We needed to get settled down, and that World War II generation really took charge of things and had really strong principles. That began, the people coming out of the Second World War started to, they started ending their tours in the 60s in some cases. And there were a lot of, and so the push to get these virtuous kind of and strong American culture and strong American leadership began to recede. And other nations began to step up. China in particular began to step up. So it's made life in the White House more serious. It was, because there was a sense that, America may be on potential decline. And how are we going to arrest that? I happen to believe strongly in national service, in a program of national service, asking every young person between the ages of 18 and 24, give us a year back. Give us a year back to work as a first responder. Give us a year. I honestly believe the military showed if you give young people a chance to really shine and give them an assignment, they'll step up to it. We did that with the World War II generation. We're not doing it now. And we should be, those of us who are older should be stepping back from the action, but stepping into mentoring, stepping in to give more support, more help, more guidance, more political cover to do this, because it's going to require some money, but it's the right thing to do to get a group of people in the next generation teed up, ready to take. It's time for the torch to pass. It's time for the torch to pass, and that's really, really important part of what we do and what comes out of the White House.
One thing that I think that really bothers me, but I don't know what we can do about it, is that where we're at in this country and in our politics is that division is very profitable. And in the media, division is money, and unity is a loser. There's no money in unity in the media. They perpetrate division. Division is what sells on 24/7 cable. Division's what sells in a lot of political books. And as long as you're dividing, you can find a way to make money. If you're willing to tell the stories, if you're willing to dish the dirt, if you're willing to betray your friends, if you're willing to say what's confidential is not confidential, you can make money. And division is profit. And that, to me, is a disaster. Second thing is, there's no competitive districts in the U.S. House. Out of 435 seats, only about 20 are in play, which means that if you're base messaging to either Republicans or Democrats, you've got a better chance of getting reelected than waking up tomorrow. And you could say, well, just stand up for what you believe in. It doesn't matter. Okay, fine, you'll lose, and that's okay. Maybe more people need to be willing to lose, but you know what? The next person's going to come up, and that's the way it's going to be. I'll give you an example. If David and I were best friends, and we lived in San Diego, and we were neighbors, and we were both in the House together, both in Congress. He's not, but let's assume he's a Democrat and I'm a Republican. We got a beer together every night. We love each other. We just don't agree with each other. His district goes that way, and it's 80% Hispanic and 80% Democrat. My district goes that way. It's 80% white and 80% Republican. He's talking about, what about the kids that are here through no fault of their own? I'm talking about a double-wide electric fence on the border, same newspaper, same media market. We couldn't lose if we tried. And everyone out here is saying, well, wait a minute, can't you guys just come together? But you tell me, okay, when every district is 80% safe, how is that going to happen? Should he betray his constituents? Should I betray mine? I'm not saying you shouldn't at times, but I'm just trying to explain to you that between the division, between the different model, in other words, it used to be, if you were on armed services, you'd make your career in Congress, you'd become an expert in armed services. You'd spend 20 years being the pro. You'd retire, you'd be sought after to give your expertise. You would go talk to the military, Lockheed Martin, whatever. Nowadays, it's about who can create the most noise, the fastest, to get the most clicks. The incentive is different. The incentive is division. The incentive is not unity. And so this is a problem. My one remedy, it's just one, and it's not going to solve it, but term limits. I don't really care who you are, how long you've been in office. Republican, Democrat, too long creates stagnant people that don't need to be there. I don't care who they are. There's other smart people that can take over and do the job. Okay, 30 seconds. You have anything positive that you want to say? I'll start. My last day in the White House. There's actually a really good story of my last day, but I'm going to skip everything except for when I left. for the last time, I'll never forget, I look back at the White House, and it's an awe-inspiring, magical scene at night. And we all love it, no matter your political persuasion. And it stands for freedom and opportunity and everything we love about this country. And I left. There's nothing on the outside that tells you what president and what party's on the inside. It is that same magical place that reminds us of how great our country is. David?
Yeah, really. I'll tell you the scariest moment for me, because it translates into some of the things we've been talking about. But shortly before Nixon resigned and stepped down in 1973, or was it? Shortly before he stepped down, he decided to make a trip to Western Europe and then into the Middle East. And I was asked to go as part of his official delegation. Anyway, we flew into 2 or 3 countries. We went to Egypt. 7,000 people, or 7 million people came out to celebrate the arrival of the American president. And we did this, did that. And we had really interesting time talking to various people. And the final stop on the whole thing was that no president for decades had been to Syria. And Richard Nixon decided he really he thought it was important that the president go to Syria. So anyway, we got geared up. The first thing we did before going there was Nixon felt very sick, and we stopped in Salzburg, and he was inspected by the doctors there, and they came back and told him he had phlebitis, and he was in danger. His life was in some danger. He ought to cut his travel schedule in half, so he could get through the thing. So Nixon said, "Thank you very much, Doc. I'll see you later." He called in his doctors and said, "This is Nixon," told his doctors, "double my schedule." Double my schedule. He wanted to come home in a pine box. He wanted to come home in a pine box. And but sometimes things in this kind of world, when you really face right up to it, you're dealing with some hard realities of the kind he talked about, the families that you deal with and so forth and so on. And it takes a strong stomach, but most of all, it takes a compassion and a real concern for our fellow human beings who are, whatever their background, whatever the color of their skin, that we're all in this. We came in different ships, as I said, but we're in the same boat together.